The 8th of May, 1945 arrived with an eerie silence across the Atlantic Ocean, a waterway that had witnessed some of the most brutal naval warfare in human history. For nearly 6 years, German U-boats had terrorized Allied shipping lanes, sending thousands of vessels to their watery graves and claiming the lives of countless sailors and civilians. But on this spring day, as Nazi Germany signed its unconditional surrender, the hunters of the deep became the hunted, and the fate of the Kriegsmarine's most feared weapon, the Unterseeboot fleet, hung in a precarious balance that would reshape naval power for decades to come. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had briefly succeeded Adolf Hitler as the head of the German state, faced an impossible dilemma. Across the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Arctic waters, over 370 U-boats remained operational, their crews uncertain whether to fight, flee, or surrender. The Grand Admiral, who had built the U-boat fleet into a formidable killing machine, now issued Operation Regenbogen, Rainbow, a controversial order that would determine the submarine's final chapter. According to historical records preserved by the British Admiralty, Dönitz initially contemplated scuttling the entire fleet, rather than allowing these technological marvels to fall into enemy hands, a decision that would have environmental and strategic consequences beyond imagination. The U-boat commanders received fragmented, contradictory orders through deteriorating communication channels. Some captains, loyal to the Nazi cause until the bitter end, chose defiance. Oberleutnant Zursee Adalbert Schnee, commanding U-2301, ignored surrender orders and continued prowling Norwegian waters, believing the war could somehow continue. Others, like Kapitänleutnant Emil Klusmeyer of U-234, made the agonizing decision to surface, hoist black flags of surrender, and await Allied escort to designated ports. The psychological torment these men endured cannot be overstated. They were warriors of the deep, trained to strike from the shadows, now forced into humiliating submission under the bright light of day. The Allied Naval Command, particularly the British Royal Navy and United States Navy, mobilized rapidly to secure these underwater predators. Operation Deadlight was formulated within days of the German surrender, a massive undertaking to account for, secure, and ultimately dispose of the U-boat fleet. The operation's name carried dark irony. These boats that had operated under the cover of darkness would meet their end in the cold light of accountability. Intelligence officers scrambled to locate every submarine, fearing that rogue crews might attempt to escape to sympathetic nations in South America or continue guerrilla warfare from hidden bases rumored to exist in remote Arctic regions. The port of Lysahally in Northern Ireland became the primary collection point for surrendered U-boats. Throughout May and June of 1945, a surreal procession unfolded as German submarines, once the scourge of the Atlantic, motored into British waters flying black flags, their crews standing on deck in full view. A stark reversal of their wartime operations. Commander Peter Gretton, a British escort commander who had fought U-boats throughout the Battle of the Atlantic, watched this parade with mixed emotions of triumph and unease, later writing in his memoirs that seeing these steel sharks rendered harmless, felt both victorious and strangely melancholic. The Allied powers quickly realized that beyond the immediate security concerns, the captured U-boats represented an unprecedented intelligence windfall. The summer of 1945 transformed from a period of celebration into a frantic scramble among the victorious nations to seize German submarine technology before their wartime allies could claim it. The emerging tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western powers meant that every technical manual, every innovative design feature, and every experienced German engineer became a prize in what historians would later recognize as the opening moves of the Cold War. The Type 21 U-boat, Hitler's Wunderwaffe or wonder weapon, attracted particular attention from Allied naval architects and intelligence services. These revolutionary submarines, designed by Professor Helmuth Walter and refined under chief constructor-engineer Heinrich Heep, could sustain underwater speeds exceeding 17 knots, more than twice the submerged speed of conventional submarines. Only 2 Type 21s, U-2511 and U-3008, became operational before the war's end. But their potential terrified Allied analysts who calculated that had Germany deployed them 6 months earlier, the entire Atlantic campaign might have taken a catastrophically different trajectory. British and American technical teams descended upon captured U-boats with unprecedented thoroughness. At Lisa Halley and later at Portsmouth, specialists dismantled submarines piece by piece, photographing, measuring, and analyzing every component. The Schnorkel breathing apparatus, which allowed submarines to run diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, particularly fascinated engineers who recognized its revolutionary potential. This German innovation, developed by Dutch engineer J.J. Wichers before the war and perfected by Kriegsmarine engineers, would become standard equipment on virtually every conventional submarine designed thereafter. Captain Edward Beach of the United States Navy, himself a submarine commander and later a renowned naval historian, participated in these technical evaluations and documented how German engineering had leapfrogged Allied submarine development by nearly a decade. The Soviet Union, despite being allocated a share of captured U-boats under the Potsdam Agreement, signed in late July 1945, operated with characteristic secrecy and aggression in securing German naval technology. Soviet naval intelligence officers, working through military government channels in occupied Germany, systematically located and recruited German submarine designers, engineers, and experienced U-boat commanders. The information referenced here comes from declassified CIA documents released in 1998, which revealed the extent of Soviet technical espionage during the immediate post-war period. Dozens of German submarine specialists, including sections of the design teams responsible for the Type 21 and the even more advanced Type 26, found themselves relocated, sometimes voluntarily, often under duress, to the Soviet Union, where they would spend years recreating their wartime innovations for their former enemies. France, though not represented at the highest levels of Allied naval planning, successfully claimed several U-boats as war reparations. The French Navy, rebuilding after years of occupation and the controversial scuttling of the fleet at Toulon in November 1942, desperately needed modern submarines to reclaim its status as a maritime power. U-471 and several other captured boats were commissioned into the French Navy, where they served into the 1960s, training a new generation of French submariners on German-designed vessels. A peculiar twist of historical irony that few contemporaries could have predicted during the dark days of the Battle of France. The most sophisticated U-boats, particularly the handful of Type 21s and the experimental Walter boats with their revolutionary hydrogen peroxide propulsion systems, were reserved for the most intensive study. The Royal Navy commissioned U-2511 into service as HMS N-41, while the United States Navy took possession of U-2513 and U-3008. These submarines would spend years conducting trials, their German crews sometimes retained as technical advisors in a remarkable transformation from enemies to consultants. The autumn of 1945 brought a cold pragmatism to the question of what to do with the hundreds of U-boats that held no intelligence value or were too damaged to merit preservation. The Allied powers, meeting through various naval commissions, concluded that the vast majority of the captured submarine fleet posed more problems than solutions. They were expensive to maintain, potentially dangerous if left intact, and represented a symbolic reminder of German militarism that the occupation authorities wished to eliminate. Thus began Operation Deadlight, a systematic destruction campaign that would send 116 U-boats to the bottom of the ocean in one of the most extensive naval disposal operations ever conducted. The waters west of Northern Ireland, specifically an area northwest of the Malin Head Peninsula, were designated as the primary scuttling ground. This location, with its deep waters and relative distance from major shipping lanes, seemed ideal for permanently disposing of the U-boat threat. Beginning in November 1945 and continuing through February 1946, British and Polish naval vessels towed surrendered U-boats to these waters, where they were systematically sunk using a combination of methods: naval gunfire, torpedoes, aerial bombing, and deliberate scuttling by opening sea valves. Commander Philip Ruck Keane, appointed to oversee Operation Deadlight, approached the task with military efficiency but couldn't entirely suppress the historical weight of what was occurring. In reports preserved in the British National Archives, he described watching U-boats, each representing millions of Reichsmarks in investment and years of engineering expertise, disappearing beneath the waves in minutes. The operation employed Polish Navy destroyers ORP Krakowiak and ORP Śląsk, crewed by men who had particular reasons for satisfaction in destroying the submarines that had blockaded their homeland and contributed to Poland's wartime suffering. These Polish sailors, fighting under British command since their nation's fall in September 1939, found grim catharsis in watching German submarines sink stern first into the Atlantic depths. Not every scuttling proceeded smoothly. Several U-boats broke their tow lines in heavy weather and sank in unintended locations, creating navigational hazards that would perplex mariners for decades. U-1051 broke free during a winter storm and drifted for 2 days before finally sinking in waters far shallower than intended. U-778 stubbornly refused to sink despite repeated torpedo hits, requiring over 4 hours of sustained gunfire before finally slipping beneath the surface. These resilient boats demonstrated the robust construction that had allowed them to operate at crushing depths and survive depth charge attacks during their operational careers. Environmental considerations, though not understood with modern ecological awareness, occasionally surfaced in planning documents. Some officers questioned whether concentrating over 100 submarines in a relatively confined area might create hazards from leaking fuel, battery acids, or other toxic materials. These concerns were generally dismissed as minimal compared to the operational imperative of quickly disposing of the fleet. Hindsight would prove these early environmental warnings prescient, as marine surveys conducted in the 21st century revealed significant contamination around the wreck sites, with diesel fuel and heavy metals leaching into the marine environment 7 decades after the scuttlings. The psychological impact on German U-boat crews, many still held in prisoner-of-war camps, varied widely when they learned their boats were being destroyed rather than preserved or reused. Some veterans expressed relief, viewing the scuttlings as a form of honorable end for vessels they had considered their steel homes. Others felt profound anger and loss, particularly crewmen from boats with distinguished service records who believed their submarines deserved better than an anonymous grave in foreign waters. While Operation Deadlight systematically destroyed captured U-boats in British-controlled waters, a more chaotic fate befell submarines caught in German ports at the war's end. The spring of 1945 witnessed a dramatic German naval retreat as Soviet forces closed in from the east and Western Allied armies advanced from all directions. Rather than allow their submarines to be captured intact, German naval commanders implemented widespread scuttling operations across Baltic and North Sea ports, creating underwater graveyards that would complicate harbor operations for generations. The port of Kiel, Germany's primary naval base throughout both world wars, became a scene of systematic destruction during the first week of May 1945. Following Admiral Dönitz's initial Regenbogen order, later partially rescinded under Allied pressure, crews opened sea valves and detonated scuttling charges on dozens of U-boats, sending them to the harbor bottom in depths too shallow to completely conceal them. British occupation forces arriving in Kiel found a devastated naval infrastructure, with submarine conning towers protruding above the water like tombstones, making the harbor nearly unusable for commercial shipping. Clearing these wrecks would require years of salvage operations and millions of pounds in post-war reconstruction funds. Hamburg's U-boat bunkers, massive concrete fortifications built to protect submarines from Allied bombing raids, contained numerous boats in various states of completion when British forces arrived. The bunkers themselves, engineering marvels with concrete roofs up to 23 feet thick, had survived the entire war essentially undamaged. Inside, British salvage teams discovered partially completed submarines, technical documents scattered in hasty evacuations, and evidence of frantic last-minute attempts to destroy equipment deemed too sensitive for enemy capture. The contrast between the bunkers' apparent indestructibility and the chaos within them symbolized the sudden collapse of German naval power, yet not every U-boat meekly surrendered or accepted destruction. In one of the war's most extraordinary episodes, several U-boats attempted escapes to neutral or Axis-sympathetic nations, hoping to find sanctuary or even continue the struggle from exile. U-530, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Kurt Lange, departed from Bergen, Norway in mid-April 1945, with intentions that remained murky even decades later. Some historians argue Lange intended to reach Argentina, where Nazi sympathizers had established networks to shelter high-ranking German officials. Others suggest his destination was Spain, or even Japan, Germany's remaining Axis partner in the Pacific. The journey of U-853 under Kapitänleutnant Helmut Sommer became legendary in naval circles, though the full truth remains contested. Departing from Kristiansand, Norway on May 6, 1945, 2 days before the official surrender, U-853 vanished from Allied surveillance. The submarine resurfaced in Argentina 2 months later, having successfully crossed the Atlantic without detection. According to records from the Argentine Naval Prefecture cited in declassified United States State Department documents from the 1990s, the crew claimed they were unaware of Germany's surrender and sought only asylum, not continued hostilities. However, intelligence reports suggested the boat may have carried fleeing Nazi officials, gold, or other contraband, fueling conspiracy theories that persist among enthusiasts to this day. U-977 achieved perhaps the most remarkable escape, reaching Argentina after a grueling 66-day voyage from Norway. Korvettenkapitän Heinz Schaefer commanded this Type 7C boat through some of the most heavily patrolled waters in the Atlantic, surviving multiple near encounters with Allied patrol vessels and aircraft. Schaefer later published a memoir of this journey, titled U-977, 66 Days Underwater, which became a bestseller in Germany, and offered rare insights into the psychology of submariners facing an uncertain future. His crew's reaction upon learning they would be interned rather than prosecuted as war criminals reportedly ranged from relief to disappointment, with some younger crew members having romanticized the prospect of continuing resistance from South American hideouts. The Allied response to these escapes combined diplomatic pressure and practical acceptance. Argentina, walking a careful line between its traditional neutrality and increasing pressure from the United States, interned the arriving U-boats and their crews but avoided extraditing submariners back to Europe for prosecution. The spring of 1945 brought Soviet forces crashing through eastern Germany with devastating momentum, and the Soviet Navy's operational groups followed closely behind the advancing Red Army, determined to seize German naval assets before their Western allies could claim them. The Baltic ports of Danzig, Königsberg, and Pillau fell to Soviet control weeks before Germany's final surrender, granting the USSR first access to U-boats trapped in eastern waters and the submarine construction facilities that had produced them. What followed was a calculated Soviet campaign to acquire not just boats, but the entire infrastructure of German submarine warfare, a campaign that would fundamentally shape Soviet naval doctrine for the next 4 decades. Unlike the methodical British and American approach of cataloging and studying captured equipment, the Soviets adopted a philosophy of wholesale appropriation. Entire design bureaus from the Schickau shipyard in Danzig and the Deutsche Werke in Kiel found themselves relocated to Leningrad and Severodvinsk, sometimes with key personnel given little choice in the matter. Professor Karl Schappler, chief designer of the Type 21's electrical systems, spent 5 years in the Soviet Union reconstructing his wartime work before being allowed to return to Germany. His experience, documented in interviews conducted by the German Federal Archives in the 1970s, revealed a Soviet technical intelligence operation operating on a scale that Western powers only partially understood during the immediate post-war period. The Potsdam Conference, convening from July 17 to August 2, 1945, attempted to bring order to the chaotic division of German military assets. Under the negotiated terms, the Soviet Union received 10 operational U-boats as war reparations, with additional boats allocated to Britain, the United States, France, and Norway. However, implementation proved contentious. Soviet representatives argued that boats captured in Soviet-occupied zones should count toward their allocation, while Western powers insisted on equitable distribution regardless of capture location. The resulting compromise satisfied no one fully, but established precedents for dividing defeated enemies' military equipment that would echo through subsequent conflicts. The Type 21 U-boats particularly captivated Soviet naval architects who recognized their transformative potential. The USSR received 4 Type 21s under the Potsdam allocation: U-2529, U-3035, U-3538, and U-3041. These boats were immediately transported to Leningrad's Naval Engineering Institute, where teams of Soviet engineers, augmented by German specialists operating under various degrees of coercion and incentive, began systematic reverse engineering. The knowledge gained from these studies directly influenced the Whiskey-class submarine program initiated in 1948, which incorporated numerous German design elements including hull configuration, battery technology, and streamlined conning towers. Captain First Rank Anatoly Rasoko, assigned to evaluate captured U-boats for Soviet naval intelligence, later wrote in his memoirs, published posthumously in 2003, that the German submarines represented a window into a future we had not yet imagined. Soviet submarine doctrine before this exposure had emphasized surface capability with limited submerged endurance, viewing submarines primarily as coastal defense vessels. The Type 21's ability to remain submerged for extended periods while maintaining high speed fundamentally challenged these assumptions. Rasoko's reports to Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy, advocated for a complete restructuring of Soviet submarine development priorities, recommendations that were largely adopted in subsequent 5-year plans. The Walter boats, experimental submarines using hydrogen peroxide propulsion designed by Professor Helmuth Walter, generated intense Soviet interest despite their operational problems. These boats theoretically could achieve underwater speeds exceeding 25 knots, a capability that would revolutionize submarine warfare if engineering challenges could be overcome. The Soviets obtained documentation on the Walter turbine system and recruited several engineers from Walter's team. Though the hydrogen peroxide propulsion system proved ultimately impractical due to its volatile nature and material requirements, the research contributed to Soviet nuclear submarine development in the following decade, demonstrating how even failed technologies can provide valuable insights. The years 1946 through 1952 witnessed an unprecedented period of submarine evaluation as the major naval powers systematically tested captured U-boats to extract every possible advantage for their own submarine programs. These were not merely academic exercises. The emerging Cold War created urgent pressure to understand and surpass German innovations before potential adversaries could do so. The captured submarines thus became floating laboratories where yesterday's enemies taught tomorrow's lessons, transforming naval warfare in ways their original designers could never have anticipated. The United States Navy established a comprehensive testing program centered at the submarine base in New London, Connecticut, and the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine. U-2513, one of the prized Type 21 boats, underwent exhaustive trials throughout 1946 and 1947. American submarine captains and engineers subjected the boat to diving tests, speed runs, and endurance evaluations that pushed the vessel to its design limits and occasionally beyond. Commander Roy Benson, a distinguished submarine officer who participated in these trials, reported to the Naval Technical Mission that German submarines operated more quietly, dived deeper, and maneuvered more responsively than any American boats then in service. Conclusions that prompted urgent recommendations for modernizing the U.S. submarine fleet. The Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program, known by its acronym GUPPY, emerged directly from lessons learned from captured U-boats. Initiated in 1947, GUPPY involved extensively modifying existing American fleet submarines to incorporate German-inspired improvements: streamlined hulls reducing underwater drag, snorkels allowing extended submersion, increased battery capacity, and numerous technical refinements copied from Type 21 designs. The first GUPPY conversion, USS Audax, completed trials in August 1947 and demonstrated dramatic performance improvements, sustaining submerged speeds exceeding 18 knots, previously thought impossible for American boats. Over the following decade, 52 American submarines received GUPPY conversions, fundamentally transforming the U.S. Navy's underwater capabilities at a fraction of the cost of building entirely new vessels. Britain's approach combined practical reuse with careful study. HMS N-41, the former U-2511, remained in Royal Navy service until 1949, training British submariners in modern underwater warfare techniques. The Royal Navy's Submarine Command Course at HMS Dolphin in Gosport integrated lessons from German operational procedures, particularly the systematic approach to convoy attacks and the sophisticated acoustic torpedo tactics developed during the Battle of the Atlantic. Lieutenant Commander Ben Bryant, director of the course, incorporated analysis of German patrol reports and tactical documents captured along with the boats, creating training scenarios based on actual U-boat operations. This integration of enemy doctrine into training, though controversial among some traditional officers, proved invaluable in preparing British submariners for Cold War patrols against the expanding Soviet fleet. The French Navy's experience with captured U-boats proved particularly long-lasting. France commissioned 4 German submarines into service under French names: Blason, formerly U-123, Buon, U-510, Lobby, U-471, and Millet, U-471. These boats served actively until the early 1960s, far longer than initially intended, partly because France's post-war economic constraints limited new submarine construction. French submariners trained on these boats absorbed German design philosophies and operational procedures, which influenced French submarine development through the 1960s. The Narval-class submarines, France's first post-war indigenous design completed in 1954, incorporated numerous features directly inspired by German engineering, including the distinctive German-style conning tower and streamlined hull form. The Royal Norwegian Navy, though receiving only one U-boat, U-926 renamed Cora, used it extensively for training and research until 1962. Norway, which had endured brutal U-boat blockades during the war, found particular motivation in mastering former enemy technology. This context is documented in the Norwegian Naval Museum archives, which contain detailed reports of how Norwegian naval officers studied the boat's capabilities to better defend against potential Soviet submarine threats in the strategic North Atlantic and Arctic waters surrounding Norway. The cold waters of the North Atlantic, where over 100 U-boats rested in their designated Operation Deadlight Graveyard, kept their secrets through the 1950s and 60s. The world moved on, focused on Cold War tensions, economic reconstruction, and the nuclear age. Yet beneath the waves, the scuttled submarines slowly deteriorated, their steel hulls succumbing to corrosion, their diesel fuel tanks gradually leaking, and their lead-acid batteries releasing toxic materials into the marine environment. It would take decades before the environmental implications of this hasty disposal method became apparent, revealing that the U-boat's capacity to cause harm extended far beyond their wartime operations. The 1970s witnessed the emergence of environmental consciousness in Western societies, driven by disasters like the Torrey Canyon oil spill of 1967 and the founding of organizations like Greenpeace in 1971. This new awareness gradually extended to historical pollution sources, including the hundreds of military vessels scuttled after both world wars. Marine biologists studying North Atlantic ecosystems began documenting unusual contamination patterns in areas coinciding with wartime wreck sites, though connecting specific contamination to specific wrecks proved challenging given the ocean's complexity and the passage of decades. Dr. Fiona Murray, a marine chemist at the Scottish Association for Marine Science, conducted pioneering research in the 1990s examining sediment cores taken from areas near known U-boat wrecks. Her findings, published in 1998, demonstrated significantly elevated levels of heavy metals including lead, mercury, and cadmium in sediments surrounding wreck sites compared to control areas. The research indicated that materials from deteriorating U-boats continued leaching into the environment 5 decades after their sinking. Diesel fuel, preserved in largely intact tanks, seeped through corroded seams at slow but steady rates, creating periodic slicks observed by fishermen and Coast Guard patrols but rarely connected to their source. The batteries aboard U-boats posed particular long-term hazards. Each submarine carried massive lead-acid battery banks. Some boats had cells weighing over 30 tons, providing power for submerged operations. As battery casings corroded, sulfuric acid and lead compounds entered the marine environment, The deeper wrecks in waters exceeding 300 feet decomposed more slowly due to cold temperatures and limited oxygen, paradoxically extending the period over which they released contaminants. Shallower wrecks exposed to warmer waters and more biological activity corroded faster, but also had their contaminants more rapidly dispersed by currents and diluted by larger water volumes. Environmental activists and scientific organizations began calling for assessment and possible remediation of historical military dump sites in the late 1990s. The International Maritime Organization, established in 1948 primarily to address shipping safety, gradually expanded its mandate to include historical contamination sources. However, the sheer scale and cost of potential remediation, involving hundreds of ships and aircraft, deliberately sunk after World War II across all the world's oceans, created political and financial barriers to action. Who would bear responsibility for cleaning up weapons of war disposed of under international agreements decades earlier? Should Germany pay despite the disposal being conducted by the victorious Allies? Should Britain, which directed Operation Deadlight, fund remediation? These questions remained largely unresolved into the 21st century. Recreational diving technology advanced significantly from the 1980s onward, bringing U-boat wrecks within reach of sport divers. The wrecks became popular dive sites, attracting both history enthusiasts and wreck divers seeking the thrill of exploring submarines. However, these activities created additional concerns. Divers disturbing wrecks could accelerate corrosion, damage structural integrity, and increase pollutant release. More controversially, artifact recovery, ranging from innocent souvenir hunting to systematic salvage of valuable brass, copper, and aluminum components, not only damaged historical sites but potentially disturbed hazardous materials sealed within deteriorating hulls. While the majority of captured U-boats met inglorious ends through scuttling, target practice, or scrapping, a fortunate few survived to serve a different purpose: preserving history and educating future generations about the realities of submarine warfare. The establishment of submarine museums from the 1950s onward provided salvation for several U-boats that would otherwise have faced the scrapper's torch, transforming weapons of war into tools of education and remembrance. These preserved boats became time capsules, offering tangible connections to a conflict that shaped the modern world. U-505, a Type 9 C-40 submarine, achieved the distinction of being the only German U-boat publicly preserved in the United States. After surrendering to the United States Navy on May 10, 1945, the boat underwent extensive evaluation before being designated for public display. In 1954, the submarine was transported to Chicago and installed as a memorial exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry, where it has remained ever since. The preservation required extensive preparation, removing weapon systems, cutting a large opening in the pressure hull to allow visitor access, and waterproofing the interior. Over 65 years, millions of visitors have walked through U-505's cramped compartments, gaining visceral understanding of the claustrophobic conditions endured by submariners regardless of nationality. Germany itself maintained several U-boats as memorials, though the process of preserving boats associated with Nazi aggression proved politically complex in the post-war decades. U-995, a Type 7 C-41, was eventually preserved at the Technical Museum in Speyer, after serving initially with the Norwegian Navy. U-2540, one of the advanced Type 21s that saw no wartime service, found preservation at the German Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven, beginning in 1984. These boats served dual purposes: honoring German submariners who served with courage in a morally compromised cause, while simultaneously educating visitors about the costs of aggressive nationalism and technological warfare. The United Kingdom preserved HMS Alliance, a British A-class submarine incorporating numerous German-inspired design improvements from post-war evaluations rather than an actual German U-boat. However, the Royal Navy Submarine Museum in Gosport maintains extensive collections of U-boat artifacts, documents, and personal effects recovered from captured boats or donated by veterans. These materials provide researchers with invaluable primary sources for understanding daily life aboard U-boats, technical developments, and the human experiences of submarine warfare. Curator Jenny Raitt initiated oral history projects in the 1990s, recording interviews with British sailors who served aboard HMS N-41 and other captured U-boats, preserving first-hand accounts before that generation passed away. France preserved U-2318 at the Écomusée d'Alsace, though this boat actually represented a recreation rather than an original wartime submarine. The authentic U-boats that served in the French Navy through the 1960s were ultimately scrapped when they became too expensive to maintain, a fate that befell most working vessels regardless of historical significance. This tension between preserving history and managing practical constraints has resulted in relatively few submarine survivors compared to the thousands built during World War II. Private preservation efforts occasionally succeeded where government initiatives faltered. U-2500, another Type 21, was saved from scrapping in the 1970s by a German enthusiast group and eventually installed at the German Maritime Museum. The restoration process required decades and millions of Deutsche Marks in donations, demonstrating both the public's historical interest and the substantial costs involved in preserving large steel structures exposed to decades of weathering and neglect. These private efforts often operated on financial knife edges, with preservation groups constantly fundraising to prevent their charges from deteriorating beyond salvation. The preserved U-boats serve educational missions extending beyond simple exhibits. School groups touring U-505 in Chicago receive structured lessons about World War II, technology's role in warfare, and the human costs of global conflict. The German Maritime Museum's exhibitions contextualizing U-2540 address difficult historical questions about collective responsibility, technological ethics, and how societies remember morally complex pasts. The knowledge and technology extracted from German U-boats cast a long shadow across Cold War submarine development, influencing naval doctrine and engineering decisions in both Western and Eastern blocs through the 1950s and 60s. The innovations that had made U-boats so deadly against Allied shipping proved equally valuable in the emerging strategic competition between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, where submarines would play crucial roles in both conventional warfare planning and nuclear deterrence. The captured boats thus became intellectual ancestors to an entirely new generation of underwater weapons, their DNA present in vessels that would have astonished even their most visionary German designers. Soviet submarine development proceeded along two parallel tracks influenced by captured German technology. Conventional submarine classes like the Whiskey and Quebec types, produced in enormous numbers during the 1950s, incorporated streamlined hulls, high-capacity battery systems, and snorkel technology directly derived from Type 21 studies. Soviet naval construction priorities emphasized quantity. Over 230 Whiskey-class boats were built between 1950 and 1958, creating a massive submarine fleet that Western naval planners feared could overwhelm Atlantic sea lanes in any future conflict, reprising the U-boat campaigns of World War II with far more sophisticated boats. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, who commanded the Soviet Navy from 1956 to 1985, explicitly cited German submarine achievements as validation for his vision of an ocean-going Soviet fleet capable of challenging Western naval supremacy. Simultaneously, Soviet engineers pursued nuclear propulsion, achieving their first nuclear submarine K-3, November class, in 1958. While nuclear technology itself owed nothing to German submarines, the hull forms, noise reduction techniques, and operational concepts developed for advanced diesel-electric boats influenced nuclear submarine design. The characteristic Soviet double-hull construction, creating internal space between pressure and outer hulls, echoed German design philosophies examined in captured boats. Soviet submariners trained on German-inspired conventional submarines carried operational doctrines and tactical thinking into nuclear boat operations, creating continuity between World War II German practices and Cold War Soviet submarine warfare. Western naval powers pursued similar technological trajectories, though generally with smaller submarine forces emphasizing quality over quantity. The United States Navy's nuclear submarine program, pioneered by Admiral Hyman Rickover, focused on creating boats with unlimited underwater endurance. a logical extension of the German goal of increasing submerged operational capability. USS Nautilus, commissioned in 1954 as the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, incorporated numerous design features refined through studies of captured U-boats, including streamlined hull forms and advanced sonar installations. Though revolutionary in propulsion, Nautilus was evolutionary in form, representing incremental improvement of concepts German engineers had explored a decade earlier. The British Royal Navy, operating under severe post-war budget constraints, pursued a mixed strategy of modernizing existing boats with German-inspired improvements, while slowly developing nuclear capability. The Porpoise-class submarines, commissioned beginning in 1958, represented Britain's first post-war indigenous design and showed clear German influence in their streamlined profiles and deep-diving capability. Britain's first nuclear submarine, HMS Dreadnought, commissioned in 1963, used an American nuclear reactor but British-designed hull and systems incorporating lessons from both German studies and British operational experience. France's submarine program, independent by necessity, due to difficult relationships with NATO allies, particularly benefited from hands-on experience operating captured U-boats through the 1950s and 60s. The Daphne-class submarines, designed in the late 1950s and produced through the 1960s, represented thoroughly modern conventional boats incorporating decades of German-inspired refinements. France pursued nuclear submarine development somewhat later than Britain and the United States, commissioning Le Redoutable in 1971, but French nuclear boats reflected design philosophies traceable to careful study of German engineering solutions to fundamental submarine challenges. The Federal Republic of Germany, barred from submarine construction by Allied occupation restrictions until the early 1950s, ironically found itself courted by NATO as Cold War tensions escalated. The 21st century brought renewed attention to the scattered remnants of Hitler's U-boat fleet, as advancing technology made previously inaccessible wrecks explorable, and environmental awareness highlighted potential hazards from deteriorating vessels. 75 years after their sinking, the U-boats continued generating controversies, discoveries, and debates that their crews could never have imagined. The submarines that once terrorized the Atlantic had become archaeological sites, environmental concerns, and historical touchstones simultaneously, their stories incomplete even after 3/4 of a century. Advanced sonar surveys conducted between 2000 and 2015 located and mapped dozens of U-boat wrecks that had remained uncharted since Operation Deadlight. The Marine Institute of Ireland conducted systematic surveys of the Deadlight disposal area northwest of Malin Head, identifying 123 distinct targets consistent with scuttled submarines in waters ranging from 150 to over 1,000 feet deep. Some wrecks rested remarkably intact, their conning towers still recognizable and hull numbers occasionally visible through marine growth. Others had collapsed or broken apart, scattered across the seabed in debris fields that required careful analysis to confirm their identity. Dr. Conor Moran, leading the Irish survey team, noted in his 2012 report that the concentration of wrecks created what marine archaeologists termed a naval graveyard of unprecedented density, offering unique opportunities for comparative preservation studies, but also raising urgent questions about cumulative environmental impacts. The development of autonomous underwater vehicles and remotely operated submersibles revolutionized U-boat wreck exploration from the 2000s onward. Expeditions no longer required human divers risking their lives in cold, deep waters. Robots equipped with high-definition cameras, sonar mapping systems, and sampling equipment could document wrecks in extraordinary detail while operating safely from surface vessels. In 2018, Ocean Infinity, a marine robotics company, partnered with naval historians to conduct comprehensive photographic surveys of accessible U-boat wrecks in the North Atlantic and North Sea. The resulting imagery, some of the first detailed views of these wrecks in decades, revealed surprisingly good preservation of some boats despite 70 years underwater. Torpedo tubes remained identifiable, deck gun mounts stood intact, and in several cases, crew personal effects were visible through openings in deteriorated hulls, poignant reminders that these steel structures had been homes to young men far from their families. Environmental remediation discussions intensified during the 2010s as climate change and ocean acidification research highlighted how changing ocean chemistry might accelerate wreck deterioration and contaminant release. The European Union commissioned studies examining the feasibility and necessity of remediating historic military dump sites, including the Deadlight wrecks. The resulting 2016 report concluded that complete remediation, raising and properly disposing of over 100 submarines, would cost an estimated €400 million and pose significant risks to both salvage workers and the marine environment from disturbed materials. The report recommended continuous monitoring, emergency response planning for catastrophic releases, and targeted remediation only for wrecks posing immediate threats to human health or critical ecosystems. This pragmatic but incomplete solution satisfied neither environmental activists demanding comprehensive cleanup nor fiscal conservatives questioning expenditure on historical contamination. Several U-boat wrecks gained protected status as war graves, particularly boats lost with all hands during their final wartime patrols or immediately after surrender. International maritime law increasingly recognized sunken military vessels as sovereign territory of their flag nation and as memorials to fallen sailors deserving respect and protection from disturbance. Germany's government formally designated several U-boat wrecks as protected war graves in the 2000s, requesting that diving and salvage activities be restricted. This designation created tensions with salvage companies seeking valuable non-ferrous metals, wreck divers pursuing historical artifacts, and scientific researchers needing access for environmental or archaeological studies. The United Kingdom, administering waters where many protected wrecks lay, worked to balance these competing interests through licensing systems and enforcement actions against unauthorized disturbance. The human dimension of the U-boat story continued evolving as the last veterans passed away. Reinhard Hartigan, who commanded U-123 during Operation Drumbeat, the devastating attacks on American coastal shipping in early 1942, died in June 2018 at age 105, among the last surviving U-boat commanders. His passing, like those of thousands of submariners before him, severed direct human connections to the U-boat experience, leaving historians dependent on archival records, artifacts, and recorded testimonies to understand what life aboard these vessels truly meant. Veterans organizations in Germany worked urgently through the 2000s and 2010s to record final oral histories, preserve documents families might otherwise discard, and ensure that submariners' perspectives, distinct from Nazi ideology though entangled with it, remained part of historical record. Public fascination with U-boats persisted into the 21st century, manifested in documentaries, books, films, and tourism. The movie Das Boot, released in 1981 but achieving renewed popularity through director's cuts and high-definition remasters, introduced millions to the claustrophobic reality of U-boat service, emphasizing the universal human experiences of fear, camaraderie, and survival that transcended political ideology. Submarine museums reported increased attendance whenever World War II anniversaries occurred, as new generations sought to understand how their grandparents' and great-grandparents' generations experienced global conflict. Scientific research continued extracting new insights from U-boat wrecks and archives. Materials scientists studied corrosion patterns on wrecked hulls to better understand how steel behaves in marine environments, research applicable to designing longer-lasting maritime structures. Marine biologists documented how wrecks function as artificial reefs, creating habitats for fish, crustaceans, and other organisms, a strange ecological legacy for weapons designed to destroy. Historians mining newly accessible German naval archives and Allied intelligence records continued refining understanding of U-boat operations, occasionally overturning long-held assumptions about specific actions or broader strategic questions. The ultimate question, what happened to the German U-boats after World War II, proved to have no single answer but rather hundreds of individual fates reflecting the chaos of war's end and the complex priorities of post-war reconstruction and Cold War competition. Some boats vanished into museum halls, preserved as educational artifacts. Others transferred to former enemies' navies, serving decades beyond their intended lifespans. Hundreds rested on the ocean floor, slowly dissolving back into the elements from which they were forged. A few escaped to distant shores, their crews seeking uncertain refuge in unfamiliar lands. The advanced boats became involuntary teachers, their secrets extracted to build new generations of submarines that would patrol Cold War seas. And through all these varied fates ran common threads: the enduring fascination with submarine warfare, the environmental consequences of hasty military disposal, and the challenge of remembering technological achievement embedded in moral catastrophe. As the 2020s progressed, the U-boats receded further into history, their physical remains continuing their slow deterioration, while their technological and historical significance remained subjects of study, debate, and reflection. The submarines built to terrorize and destroy had become, through time's passage, artifacts teaching lessons their builders never intended, about the costs of war, the persistence of environmental impacts, the complexity of technological progress, and the common humanity of sailors on all sides who ventured into the ocean's depths, many never to return. The steel sharks of the Atlantic had been defanged, but they had not been forgotten, and their stories continued unfolding beneath the waves and in the archives, museums, and memories of those who sought to understand what had happened in humanity's darkest hour and the decades that followed.